Chilling tales for dark nights.
Jinnu by Meagan J. Meehan. Performed by Ashley Tolfo. The estate was opulent, a palace among mere mansions. Yet to Chelsea Blackburn, it was a miserable prison of boredom and routine. Grand, yet familiar, and familiarity bred contempt. The manor was evidence of the great wealth and privilege that had once belonged to the Blackburn family, a lifestyle Chelsea had never known. It had been nearly a century since the clan had been truly prominent. Even Chelsea's father had not experienced the majestic heyday of the family legacy. Unlike their ancestors, they had never been invited to balls or galas. They existed in the shadows of excess, devoid of the pleasures of extravagance that the house portrayed. It had high ceilings and winding staircases, thick stone walls and grand fireplaces, dozens of rooms and quarters for servants, spaces that were now empty. The manor's decor was aging, yet lavish, which enabled the house to maintain its dignity despite its present owner's problematic financial circumstances. Chelsea roamed the halls, covered by lush Persian carpets and lit by glass chandeliers that glowed golden. There were dozens of oil paintings, mostly portraits of well-dressed and long-dead relatives, and intricately carved wooden furniture that would last for centuries. There had once been considerable quantities of jewelry, silverware, and porcelain, but the majority had been sold over the past 50 years. Now all the remaining treasures were in the attic, a place Chelsea was barred from, but infiltrated whenever she could. Chelsea's father, Henry, inherited the mansion and the acres of land it stood upon from his Uncle George. George, an eccentric bachelor, had lived his life in the lap of luxury and spent his fortune traveling to far-off locations like Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where he had amassed various artifacts. Uncle George, a private person, built a huge stone wall around the grounds and ensured that there was only one entrance into the premises, which was guarded by a wrought iron gate painted the darkest shade of black. Throughout his life, he embarked on his own adventures and shirked all traditional rules. Chelsea had never met her Uncle George. He died before her parents were married, but she assumed that he had been completely bonkers. To his credit, he hadn't been responsible for any of the terrible investments that had ultimately bankrupted the Blackburns. In fact, Uncle George had been quite the businessman. He created a business out of his assorted oddities collection by opening and operating an antique shop in the city's downtown. Of course, most downtown dwellers couldn't afford to buy anything, so George changed tactics. He turned the shop into a curiosities museum and charged the public admission to enter. When George passed away, he had left all his worldly goods to his favorite nephew, Henry. Henry had been cared for by George since the age of 16, after his father committed suicide, and his mother had a nervous breakdown. Insanity, Chelsea noted, plagued all the Blackburn women. Even her mother Agatha, who had married into the family, hadn't been quite right. Apparently, mental instability attracted Blackburn men. Motherhood hadn't suited Agatha. The scarce memories Chelsea had of her were not fond ones. When Chelsea was 3, Agatha had fallen off the roof, to her death. At least, that was what Henry said. Now older and wiser at age 11, Chelsea strongly suspected that her mother had purposefully thrown herself down, wishing to die. Agatha's death had turned Henry cold and standoffish. Chelsea, meanwhile, hadn't been dismayed. They hadn't liked each other, and so she had no reason to mourn her mother's passing. Since then, Chelsea spent her days confined to the house or languishing in its sizable gardens, as her father locked himself in the study. Her only company was her tutor, Miss Iverson, and Sarah, the wretched maid. Chelsea utterly disliked dowdy old Miss Iverson, who constantly pestered her to polish her pianist skills, but she outright hated beautiful, perfect Sarah. While Miss Iverson was only the latest in a string of tutors, few lasted long with Chelsea, Sarah had been a near constant presence and enemy for over 4 years. Sarah worked at the estate 3 days a week, and as much as Chelsea tried to ignore her, there was something about the servant that captivated and enraged her. Sarah was 19 and much prettier than Chelsea, which seemed woefully unjust considering that she was also much poorer than Chelsea. In spite of how far the Blackbournes had fallen in high society circles, they were still undeniably privileged. Utterly unlike Sarah, who toiled away as a maid for 3 different households 6 days a week. Once, Chelsea asked where she lived, and the maid confessed to residing in a small row house, cramped with several younger siblings and a sickly mother. Sarah was a pitiful creature burdened with a difficult life. The sole advantage she held over Chelsea was her looks. Sarah was undeniably beautiful, and Chelsea was indescribably jealous. Chelsea had first noticed her unfortunate features at age 10. Prior to that, she hadn't thought much about her pudgy belly, frizzy hair, and buck teeth. She rarely registered her broad nose, too far apart eyes, and dull brown hair, until one day she looked in the mirror and realized that she didn't look anything like the fairies illustrated in her storybooks. Fairies were dainty and delicate. Stubby Chelsea resembled the depictions of witches. Sarah, however, was tall and slim, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes, the incarnation of loveliness. One day, Chelsea had been in town with her father on a rare outing to the curiosity shop and heard a group of young men whistling and shouting. Several stable boys were desperately vying for the attention of Sarah as she hurried down the street, wicker basket in hand, obviously on an errand. The sight had filled Chelsea with envy. She knew she was too young to be courted, but one day she would be expected to marry. But how was she to marry when she didn't look like Sarah? Moreover, why should some common Sarah be graced with good looks when she, a Blackbourne, was not? It was simply unacceptable. Sarah hadn't as much as glanced in the boy's direction. Clearly, such attention was too common an occurrence to warrant a reaction. Chelsea had never been fond of Sarah, but her indifference turned to loathing after witnessing that scene. She vowed to punish Sarah for her blessed features and tormented her every chance she got. She switched the labels on the salt and pepper shakers. She threw mud on newly washed sheets as they dried on the line. She hid the broom and misplaced the kettle, and when questioned, denied everything. Sarah started avoiding Chelsea, a fact that elated the younger girl and filled her with an intoxicating sense of power. Chelsea felt a similar sense of accomplishment every time she frightened off a tutor. She disliked learning and threw wild tantrums whenever anyone tried to make her sit for a lesson. Her father did nothing to quell her, and the tutors dared not strike her. She was still a Blackbourne, after all. So they simply left to find greener pastures, or at least more agreeable students. The same thing happened with the nannies. From age 3 to 7, Chelsea had been burdened with several minders whom she successfully sparred with until her father finally stopped hiring them. Miss Iverson was the sole teacher she hadn't managed to banish. The elderly spinster Miss Iverson always looked after Chelsea whenever her father had an appointment. Henry rarely took Chelsea along with him since she acted up relentlessly and had a tendency to make a spectacle of herself at formal events. Chelsea didn't mind staying in Miss Iverson's care since she had diligently studied plants and herbs and knew precisely how to spike the old woman's tea and make her fall into a long, deep slumber. Whenever Miss Iverson drifted off to sleep, Chelsea seized the opportunity to ascend into the attic. She had even taught herself how to pick locks solely for the purpose of exploring it. Chelsea was inexplicably enticed by the attic. It was as if something inside of it called out to her incessantly. She liked its dim light and its musty smell. She liked the sight of cobwebs and dust. Mostly, she was fascinated by the masses of objects stacked on top of each other, all things from Uncle George's collection that had not been selected for display at the curiosity shop. Chelsea thought deeply about the treasures. Who were the original owners? How had Uncle George come to possess them? Unanswerable questions, of course, but also divine food for thought. Time drifted idly as she wandered aimlessly among ancient armor and dulled swords, fierce-looking carved masks and oddly fleshy objects in jars filled with yellowed liquids. Chelsea was especially fond of the jars which contained half-formed pigs and eels and cows. One jar even looked as if it held a human baby, although she couldn't imagine how a baby could have possibly ended up in a bottle. She had been rummaging through the attic looking for more jars, or, better yet, papers confirming what they were and where they were from, when she stumbled across the trunk. It was medium-sized, upholstered with aging brown leather, fastened with brass-buckled-like locks. It was an unremarkable thing that Chelsea would normally cast aside without a second glance. But something about the trunk pulled her toward it magnetically. She crept closer, unable to take her eyes off it. On a whim, she reached out and touched the lid. As soon as her palm connected with its surface, an odd, dizzying feeling came over her, as if she was being lifted out of her body, while another presence entered her head. Chelsea was aware that the voice was in her mind, but somehow it also seemed to be emanating from inside the trunk. Her sudden intense urge to carry the trunk down 3 flights of stairs and into the garden seemed ludicrous considering that it was nearly as big as she was. Yet, apparently, the chest was lightweight, because the next thing Chelsea knew, she was sitting on the garden's lush, overgrown grass, under her beloved hemlock trees, fiddling with the trunk's locks. Strangely, she had no memory of actually carrying it downstairs or of leaving the attic. The final lock came undone with a snap, and Chelsea eagerly lifted the lid. She was instantly overcome by a thick, grayish-white cloud. At first she thought it was dust or smoke, but it had a strangely intoxicating aroma that was both timeless and exotic. It was like no other scent she had ever known. Then, with a sound somewhere between a gasp and a yawn, a lithe creature arose from the confines of the trunk. Its body was white, yet vapid, like a ghost, although it better resembled an insect than a human. It had long, spindly limbs, arms, legs, fingers and large black eyes. Its nose was non-existent, its mouth merely a small straight line near the bottom of its oval head. It had no hair or clothes. Its gender was indeterminable. Chelsea stumbled backwards, but excitement quickly overcame her initial fear. She had read books about these creatures before, and although they traditionally emerged from sealed, fancy bottles, it could only be one thing: a genie. "You've got to grant me 3 wishes," Chelsea shouted at the creature. "I'm entitled to 3 wishes." The creature cocked its head to the side, examining her. "I said," Chelsea continued, but then the being spoke.
"I heard you, small one. But I do not understand why you want only 3 wishes. You could have so much more."
Chelsea's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she inquired. The creature stretched.
"You freed me. I've been in there for ages. I must show my gratitude."
"Good. I want a new music box, a gold one, inlaid with diamonds and pearls."
"But that's not what you truly desire, now is it?"
the creature challenged. "Of course it is," Chelsea spat. "I wouldn't have asked for it otherwise."
Material things may be pretty, but getting your way is so much more satisfying. Don't you think?
Crooned the creature.
"I specialize in fate. If you want something to happen, I can assist you."
Chelsea stared at the creature wordlessly, intrigued.
"If you let me live in your lush garden, I can help you with all your problems,"
the creature explained.
"My advice is golden, and my magic is potent. I can help you with all that ails you, but my presence must be our secret. You wouldn't want to share my attentions, now would you?"
Chelsea vigorously shook her head.
"My remaining request is that you bring me food, preferably meat. I don't eat much, but when I'm hungry, I'm ravenous."
Chelsea skeptically considered the offer. "Tell me this," she tested. "How do I rid myself of my tutor? I'm tired of her, and I want my father to fire her at once." The creature's mouth twisted upwards in a sinister grin.
"That's easy,"
it replied.
"Spread rumors about her, tarnish her supposedly pristine reputation. Tell your father that she's aging, and she is starting to disclose scandalous little secrets. Perhaps she had an affair, or 2, with men, or boys, or maybe even other ladies. That wouldn't be proper at all, now would it?"
Chelsea had never thought about spreading nasty untruths regarding Miss Iverson, but it could certainly work. She was aging, and did mumble on and on from time to time. Who's to say that she couldn't have confessed some dark secrets? "And what about that horrid maid?" Chelsea hissed. "She's even worse, scurrying around, flaunting her beauty, mocking me with her existence. She must be stopped.
If you really want to punish her, take away her beauty,
the creature replied.
Scarring her face will be a fate worse than death. After all, if you make her lose one of her pretty eyes, she'll have to suffer as an invalid for years, decades, forevermore.
How do I do it? Chelsea pleaded, trembling with glee and amused by the creature's cunning ways. She already felt a strong kinship with it than with any human she had ever known.
I'll guide you,
the creature promised.
I aid those who are loyal to me. Have we a pact?
Chelsea did not hesitate to accept the creature's terms. The next thing Chelsea knew, she was back in the attic, sitting on the floor with the trunk in its original position. She didn't remember bringing it upstairs or pushing it back into place. It was as if she had done so in a trance. A sudden wave of sorrow washed over her. It was all nothing more than a daydream. Yet, when Chelsea glanced out the attic window, she was elated to see the oddly elegant creature coiling itself around the branches of the hemlock trees. A dream it was not. Within a week, Miss Iverson was fired. Henry had been horrified by his daughter's accusations of the tutor's unladylike behavior, especially when Chelsea told him about how Miss Iverson had caressed her. Needless to say, the old woman was not provided with a reference. Yet, the ultimate glory came 3 days later, when the hated Sarah was finally permanently marred. Following the creature's advice, Chelsea tightened all the piano strings and partially cut several with a kitchen knife. Then she ordered the maid to dust inside the piano. As soon as Sarah opened the cover, the steel strings popped off and slashed her face. Her screams were music to Chelsea's ears. There had been a lot of blood. Sarah's right eye was completely ruined, and the skin across most of her face was covered with deep gashes that would definitely leave lifelong marks. Sarah had spent weeks in the hospital, stitched up like a rag doll, and never returned to work. Several months after the maiming, Chelsea had spotted Sarah in town walking, with a black veil over her face to conceal her disfigurement. Young men stood on the corner, yet not one whistled, clapped, or called. Chelsea was pleased. Over time, Chelsea learned the creature's name, Jinnu, and accommodated its feeding requirements. During dinners of chicken or steak, prepared by the new housekeeper, a quiet woman who was neither beautiful nor bothersome, Chelsea saved some morsels and sneaked them out to Jinnu. Neither her father nor the new maid ever complained, which was good, since anyone who annoyed Chelsea was guaranteed to meet with misfortune. Jinnu's presence ensured that Chelsea always got whatever she wanted. After feigning trauma from the alleged assault of Miss Iverson, Chelsea convinced her father that she was educated enough for a girl of her status. Without any scheduled activities, Chelsea spent her days learning how to mix potions to rid her of pimples and to straighten her frizzy hair. Jinnu was quite satisfied in the garden. The creature nested in the darkest portion of shrubbery, hidden away among the hemlock trees and poison ivy, and built an elaborate nest by weaving silky white tendrils together, creating a web just as spiders did. It was also eating more. When the leftover scraps were no longer enough, Chelsea started capturing birds, squirrels, rabbits, and the occasional stray cat for the creature to dine upon. The massive grounds of the Blackbourne estate were unkempt since the family no longer had the means to afford the gardeners that the property required. Due to the wild and undisturbed conditions of the land, Chelsea was utterly shocked when her father managed to catch a glimpse of Jinnu one day, several years after its arrival. Henry had been pacing around the grounds, worried about the cost of Curiosity Shop's rent. He got too near to the hemlock trees and spotted Jinnu slithering around the upper branches. Henry Blackbourne screamed and ran into the house, hysterically ranting about snakes.
God in heaven, there's a giant snake thing in the garden.
Chelsea found him in the living room, searching for his old Crimean war sword, fully intending to slay the creature in the trees. She calmed him and accompanied him back to the garden and eventually convinced him that there was nothing there. Yet, Henry remained suspicious and continued searching around the garden. So, Chelsea decided that he had to go. Chelsea fixed him tea laced with cyanide and told the doctors that he had died in his sleep.
Child.
There was no reason to be suspicious. Henry was aging, and financial stresses often weakened older men's hearts. Chelsea, being of legal age, inherited the entire estate. She felt no qualms about what she had done, since she had done it on behalf of Jinnu. After all, the creature doted on her far more than her father ever had. Once named the proprietor of the estate, Chelsea promptly sold the Curiosity Shop and its remaining items. She fired the housekeeper and lived like a hermit off her dwindling inheritance. She took up gardening zealously, planting additional hemlock and spindly trees, along with deadly flowers such as foxglove, ragwort, oleander, and yellow jessamine. She even started a makeshift greenhouse in an upstairs bedroom, cultivating Venus flytraps and other assorted poisonous vegetation, until the house was surrounded by a prism of colors. Sometimes it seemed like the garden was enchanted, alive. Trees whispered, petals snapped, vines coiled, and roots twisted and pulled. In her spare time, Chelsea explored Uncle George's library. He had collected books about uncommon yet fascinating subjects. Histories of wars and dead languages, medieval medical practices, instructions on potions and spells. One book regarding human escapades with supposedly mythical beings included an illustration that claimed to depict a Middle Eastern knight slaying evil jinn, dark forms of genies, somewhat akin to Jinnu. Below the artwork read the caption, "Imam Ali conquers jinn, unknown artist, 1568. Chelsea paid it no mind. Time ticked by, its rules non-applicable on the Blackbourne property. Chelsea never seemed to age a day over 30. But Jinnu grew bigger and hungrier, and unable to hunt efficiently on its own, depended on Chelsea. She started traveling to the poor side of town at night, frequenting the dingiest pubs and the shabbiest inns to prey on the rabble of society. Initially, she pretended to be a charity worker and tricked working girls, destitute widows, and hapless orphans into following her home, where Jinnu feasted upon them. authorities never came to the estate asking questions. The poor were seldom missed. During the course of her rare interactions with other people, Chelsea came to the realization that she was no longer the plain, borderline ugly child she had once been. She subsequently learned how to use her beauty to woo men back to the estate. At first, such seductions had been risky, as only the true dregs of society, like men newly released from prison, would accept such an improper offer. However, with each additional trip into town, such propositions were met with increasing ease. Apparently, the decency of the commoners was being eroded at an astounding pace. Chelsea wasn't sure exactly how many times a year Jinnu had to eat. The creature simply got hungry when it got hungry. Gradually, Chelsea learned its meals were extremely infrequent, occurring every few years, perhaps every few decades. She supposed it was possible that a human body could fill Jinnu up for thousands of days, just as a large rat would fill a snake for months. All the clocks on the estate had long since stopped working, and time was a riddle. But indications of change abounded whenever Chelsea ventured into the village. On one trip, she would spy a newly constructed building, and on the next, the same building would be decrepit with age, as if it was still there at all. The fashions changed even more dramatically. Topcoats and corsets turned into casual suits and sequined dresses, then blue jeans and poodle skirts, followed by bright, obnoxious colors that Chelsea heard referred to as tie-dye. That changed to pastels and black leather jackets worn by men and women with enormous hairstyles. Next, men paraded around in baggy pants, and women stuffed themselves into impossibly tight jeans. Chelsea was not a fan of any of these styles, but she made sure to occasionally entice a female victim back to Jinnu's lair, merely to acquire clothing in which to blend into the crowds. Yet, no matter what she wore, her outfits always seemed to be slightly dated each time she exited her estate. Another telling sign of the passing time was the gadgets that the villagers used. The days of horses and carriages had morphed into a world full of cars, radios, and loud blaring boxes called televisions. Most recently, people walked around staring at small rectangles of light that they held in their hands. Sometimes they even spoke to them. Chelsea hadn't the slightest idea what these devices actually did, but they were called phones, and most people seemed quite reliant on them. Although Chelsea shunned most technological advances, on one fairly recent trip, she acquired a brand new Bakelite radio, and she took great pleasure in dancing to the music known as jazz. Of course, every time she switched the radio on, the stations were different, as if the programming changed overnight. What was the value of one night in the mansion to the outside world? A year? A decade? A century? Chelsea couldn't say. She lived to amuse the creature. She sang and danced for it, and in return it kept her young and vital. After years of listening to Jinnu speak of the sumptuousness of human flesh, Chelsea decided to sample it, and quickly named it her favorite meat. She took to joining Jinnu in its meals, devouring everything but the bones, which she used to decorate the manor's interior. She was especially fond of human skulls. Eventually, Chelsea was forced to alter her hunting methods. The new world was full of security cameras, and it was no longer easy to quietly obtain victims. Jinnu knew exactly how to change tactics. The creature convinced Chelsea to start rumors around town about the Blackbourne estate being haunted by the spirits of mentally ill persons. It was a silly, juvenile story, but it was also the stuff of urban legends. Chelsea assumed the fictitious tale would catch on like wildfire. And she was right. Approximately 2 weeks after Chelsea's latest visit to town, which would have been as much as 2 decades in the outside world, 4 teenagers scaled the fence and stormed the garden like Vikings set on pillaging a village. It was a dark, moonless night, and the uninvited guests blindly stumbled through the tall, untamed grass, shouting and giggling and reeking of alcohol. They were all holding their phones, but technology was useless on the Blackbourne estate. The entire group cursed their blank, unresponsive screens. None of them saw Chelsea coming until it was too late. She swept down upon them like a storm, expertly dispatching all of the bodies in seconds before they could so much as scream. Jinnu and Chelsea both ate well that evening. Chelsea supposed that she would have to purchase a freezer to store excess meat, since she assumed their meals would be coming to them quite regularly in the future. She assumed wrong. Chelsea was entirely unaware of the emergence of social media, and this ignorance proved to be her downfall. 4 teenagers vanishing at the same time raised alarms throughout the village. When the police checked the missing youth's web pages, they discovered that the group had been planning a trip to the long-abandoned Blackbourne estate. Approximately 12 hours after the teens' disappearance, a police search party descended upon the mansion. Chelsea had been asleep in her bed, belly full and satisfied, when she was jolted awake by the sound of the intruders cutting through the locked wrought iron gate. She glanced out her window, saw the flashing lights, and heard several voices speaking in tense tones. Extreme fear immediately seized her. The plebeians were breaking in, perhaps intending to riot or loot. Maybe the world is at war again, Chelsea thought as she ran to the garden. Her panic was palpable as she imagined the villagers' discovery of the array of bones placed throughout her home. Jinnu was resting, hibernating, in its shroud-like cocoon, which glistened silver against the dark green branches of hemlock. In desperation, Chelsea violently shook the web. Jinnu awoke, hissing furiously. "Commoners are storming the grounds!" Chelsea wailed. "Too many for me to slay! Protect me!" For several moments, Jinnu remained still and stared at Chelsea, studying her. Finally, it beckoned her with its long, limber fingers. Chelsea had never entered the creature's nest before, but she eagerly crawled in, surprised to discover that the dwelling was warm and cozy, more like a tent than a web. Chelsea was starting to relax when Jinnu turned to face her. Its eyes were black and cold and utterly merciless.
Our pact is resolved,
It hissed, and promptly attached its gaping mouth to Chelsea's pale neck. Jinnu knew its survival depended on disguising itself amid the treetops and waiting for the chaos to subside. It summoned all of its energy and moved away from its silky nest, knowing full well that it would be difficult to find such cushy accommodations ever again. All of its human keepers, slaves, eventually faltered and had to be destroyed. But Chelsea had been the cleverest and longest lasting of all its caretakers. Ironic, considering that Jinnu had initially been disappointed by how young and small she was. It had greatly underestimated the girl. That Chelsea was rotten deep within her core made her rare amongst humans, but indescribably useful to beings of Jinnu's ilk. The creature knew it would be fortunate to ever master another such host, but it also knew that it needed to start looking. As soon as the humans saw the conditions inside the manor, they were likely to have the building condemned. Remaining in the garden was simply not an option. Jinnu crept along the tree branches, staying close to the estate walls. It slithered toward the back of the garden, where the overgrown shrubbery was thickest, knowing that it could probably climb over that section of the wall, undetected if need be. Suddenly, Jinnu heard voices.
I can't imagine what they found.
That place is an enigma.
I'd love to see the garden, though. It's probably the only private property in the county with more plants than mine.
This statement piqued Jinnu's interest. The creature hailed originally from a land of sand and heat, an abhorrent environment which it had no fond memories of. It much preferred greenery and gardens. Jinnu peered over the wall and saw a man and a woman. Both were holding cameras and standing beside cars. The trunk of the man's car was ajar. As soon as they looked away from the wall, Jinnu snatched the opportunity. It hurried over the stone barrier and slunk into the invitingly dark trunk. A few minutes later, the man bid the woman goodbye, placing its camera in the trunk, and shut the lid. He was completely unaware of the presence of Jinnu, lurking in the back corner. This pleased the creature. It would wait for the man to pop open the trunk. Then, they would make a deal.
Chilling tales for dark nights.